So this is a talk that I'll be giving on November 15th at UCI for the Institute for Mathematical Behavioral Sciences. And it's called Quantitative Approaches to Learning Linking Theories in Language. And so the first question I think really is about linking theories. So let's consider this sentence right here. The little girl blicked the kitten on the stairs. Right? And we don't really know what the word blick means, but we have some sense about what this is likely to mean. For example, we know who the event participants are. We know it involves a little girl and a kitten and some stairs, right? We know the event participants. We also, as adults, know the syntactic positions that these things are appearing in. We know what comes before the verb is a subject-y thing. What comes after the verb in English is an object-y thing. What comes after a preposition is an oblique object-y thing, right? So we now have some knowledge about these syntactic positions. And because of this, we are able to interpret the little girl blicked the kitten on the stairs as corresponding to this event of a little girl doing something to a kitten and that event happening on the stairs. That is a much more likely interpretation for this utterance than some other perfectly logically possible options. So a little girl doing something to a stairs and that happening on a kitten, or the stairs doing something to a kitten and that happening on a little girl, or the kitten doing something to the little girl and that happening on the stairs, right? These are less likely for the little girl blicked the kitten on the stairs than that one. And the question is, why? And so one answer is that we as adults have linking theories that help us interpret verbs in combination with their arguments. So the arguments are things like the little girl, the kitten, and the stairs. And in particular, these linking theories are mental representations that we as adults have developed. They let us link event participants, like these guys here, and syntactic positions like subject and object and oblique objects, so that we know how to interpret an utterance even when we don't even know what the verb means, like the verb blick here, right? So what exactly does a linking theory look like? And it turns out that there are a couple of current proposals, both of which, the ones that we're going to talk about, the variants involve innate knowledge about these links. So the first part is they involved event participant roles, which are typically talked about as thematic roles. So you have an agent or an experience or an event, a patient or a theme or a goal or a source or a location, any number of event participant roles that map to these thematic roles. And you also have the syntax, knowing about, say, the subject and the object and the oblique object position. And so what each of these proposals does, what each of these linking theories looks like, is first there's an intermediate representation, and then there's a mapping to the syntax from that intermediate representation. So the first one is the uniformity of theta assignment hypothesis, or Utah for short. And the idea with Utah is that the thematic roles that we have down here, however many there are, map to one of three fixed macro or proto-roles. So you have proto-agents, so the ones that tend to be doers, those map to proto-agent. Those that tend to be done to are proto-patient, and those that are others, like maybe goal or source or location, are in the other role, right? You have three fixed macro roles, three fixed categories of thematic representations where all of these things map to. And then from that, these then map to syntactic positions, right? So the proto-agent, in fact, maps to subject, the proto-patient maps to object, and the elsewhere maps to whatever's left over, basically the oblique object. So that's Utah. Now, an alternative is a relativized form of this, relativized Utah. And the idea here is that the intermediate representation is a hierarchy, an ordering of these thematic roles. We're saying maybe agent is higher than experiencer, which is higher than theme, which is higher than patient, which is higher than all these other ones, right? There's an ordering, right? And so whichever ones are present, you know which is first highest and second highest and third highest and so on. And so that's your intermediate representation. And when whichever ones are present map in order to the available syntactic position. So if you have an agent and a patient and a location present, as we have here, those are going to map to subject, to object, and to oblique object in that order. So those are our two proposals that are out there really in linguistic theory. Utah and Rutah, the relativized form of it, assume that the mapping from that intermediate thematic representation to the syntactic positions is innate, like it's just built in as part of your biology. Now an alternative is that this mapping is derived from language experience, right? So you still have whatever thematic representation you're using, whether it's the fixed one or the relative one, but you're learning what the mapping is between that intermediate representation and the syntactic positions. So these are the derived alternatives, really, that maybe aren't discussed so much currently in the literature. And so these are all viable options for linking theory proposals. So the question is, which is likely to be correct? And I would like to suggest that one way to investigate this is to make what I like to call an argument from acquisition, which is simply asking which of these proposals about linking theories, in this case, which ones are compatible with the observed development of this linking knowledge in children. Whichever ones are, we have developmental or acquisition support for, right? And so the good news is that these proposals in many cases will make developmental predictions. So in particular, proposals that rely on innate knowledge typically assume early maturation of that innate knowledge. So that knowledge is present as early as we can test for it. And so the implication would be that a learner who has knowledge of the mapping to syntax should always match real children's behavior best because they innately have it. It's always there. Now, in contrast, proposals that rely on derived knowledge typically assume it takes some time for children to derive that knowledge from their inputs. So in this case, a learner who has knowledge of the mapping to syntax shouldn't always match real children's behavior best. In fact, a learner without this mapping knowledge, this linking knowledge, should match younger children best if you're deriving it over time, right? So these are our developmental predictions or implications. And in fact, the very same evaluation can be done for learners who use a fixed thematic system, like Utah depends on, versus a relative one, right? Like Rutah depends on. So the answer is, the question rather, is which ones match real children's behavior best? That's what we're after. So, okay, great. What behavior should we look at that would leverage or harness or rely on this kind of linking theory knowledge? And I would like to suggest that one answer is the development of verb classes, that is, classes of verbs, clusterings of verbs that children create in order to generalize about the verb linguistic behavior in the language that they're learning. So why verb classes in particular? Think about this way, is that linking theories, this link between the event participant roles and the syntactic positions, they're precisely about one very key aspect of verb behavior, which is how these verb arguments are interpreted, right? Why is the little girl the one doing and the cat being done to and the location on the stairs, right? These are the verb arguments are being interpreted because of their syntactic position. So linking theory knowledge could really affect how children choose to cluster verbs together into these verb classes. So more particularly, I think it helps to see an example of this. How would linking knowledge affect verb clustering in children? Let's consider the Utah one, where you have a fixed thematic representation and you have an expectation of where these representations are mapping to in the syntax. And what we see here with this passive sentence, the kitten was blicked by the little girl, is that the kitten is having something happen to it, so it's that kind of patient-y. And the little girl is the one doing it, so she's rather agenty. And this is really not the mapping that we expect, right, under Utah. So if children expect a mapping already, the particular mappings that we talked about, it's probably pretty salient when that mapping doesn't hold. And we might interpret this, children might interpret this as some kind of movement, right? And verbs that do this movement might be clustered together, right? So a child might abstract away from the details of what exactly is going where and just say, well, I had an expectation of a mapping. It was violated. Movement must be going on. In fact, a couple instances of movement are happening. This is a verb that likes to do movements of particular kinds. And the same is true of Rutah. So in this case, the agent is the one doing, the patient is the one done to, and they have highest and second highest. Again, they're not going where you expect them to go. So you might be interpreting this as instances of movement and use that to cluster verbs together that undergo this kind of movement. If, however, children don't expect a mapping already, then what they may do is track the details of where certain thematic representations appear and use that to cluster verbs. So in this case, they have, say, a fixed representation and they don't have any expectation of what goes where. They're just paying attention to the fact that pro-agent went here and proto-patient went there. They're encoding the details really, of the distribution of these thematic representations in a way that they didn't before if they already expected a mapping. And again, the same is true of the relative representation. They're paying attention to where does the highest one go, where does the second highest one go, and they're encoding that more detailed information and using that to help cluster verbs together. So the good news for verb classes is that we have a really strong empirical foundation. We have a lot of empirical data about the development of verb class knowledge. We have experimental studies of children's behavior, which would be the output of learning, and corpus studies of their input. So what is the input to learning? And so using that, what I want to do today is first talk about evaluating these different linking theory proposals using developmental modeling. And then what we'll find is that the derived theories, the ones where you don't build in the mapping, are actually quite compatible with children's observable behavior. So we're going to use quantitative methods to explore how a linking theory could actually be derived from children's input.